Hi everyone, in this video we're going to look at just a list of stakeholders that hopefully will help you understand the future videos. Some of them you've probably heard of before, some of them you won't have. So they're just stakeholders that are involved in employee relations. So the ones we're going to go through the employee, the employer, which you've all obviously heard about because we've spoken about them all year. Then we're going to go through unions, employer associations, peak union bodies, employer bodies, and then the government. So I'm just going to, in order to explain it, we're going to go through an example. So I've just used Metricon as an example. So Metricon is the employer, and the employer, obviously the builders and contractors that work for Metricon. So the employee, they want fair pay and good working conditions. And the employer wants to be competitive, remain competitive and profitable to meet their objectives. Now, obviously, not all organisations want to be profitable because there's not-for-profit organisations and there's governments, etc., but they still want to meet their objectives. Next, the union. So in terms of in the building and construction industry, you've got the CFMEU, which is the union which represents the employees, and then you've got the Master Builders Australia, which is the employer association, which represents Metricon, or can represent Metricon if Metricon requires them to do so. So the union represents employees. That's normally in terms of negotiation of wages and working conditions, and the employer association represents employers in negotiation of wages and working conditions. And they also offer advice. So the union can offer advice, just to make sure that an employee is getting paid correctly, and that the employer is actually implementing everything that's been agreed upon in a contract. Continuing on, we've got then peak union bodies, which represent a group of unions, and then we've got peak employer bodies, which represent a group of employer associations. So we've got there the ACTU represents a whole heap of unions, and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry represents a whole heap of employer associations, especially when it comes to the government, when they're setting minimum wages, when they're setting industrial awards and things like that. So they can represent them, especially when it's in terms with the government. So peak union bodies campaign politically on behalf of the unions. They can also be involved in dispute resolution if a dispute arises. Peak employer bodies campaign politically on behalf of the employer associations, and they can also be involved in dispute resolution. And then there's the government, which is involved in setting minimum wages. So the current body for employer relations for the government is Fair Work Australia. It's been called a number of different things over the years, but at the moment it's Fair Work Australia, and their role is to approve agreements. So once employees and employer decide on an agreement on what wages and working conditions are going to be, it has to go to Fair Work Australia. Fair Work Australia look over it and approve it. They are involved in dispute resolution. They set the minimum wages. They modernise industrial awards, which we'll get into all that in a later video. They implement any legislation, and also the government, not necessarily Fair Work Australia, but the government is an employer in terms of police, nurses, teachers, clerks, etc., etc. So just to recap, stakeholders involved in employer relations include employees, employers, unions, employer associations, peak union bodies, peak employer bodies, and the government. So for questions and activities to help you revise this video, go to teachingbubble.com.